Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Um, yep, we are live. Let's start recording this. Okay, there you go. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair to Sister Hana, the founder of Pepper and Pine. Mashallah, tabrakallah. Huge fan. This is a fan moment, although I've contained my excitement very well. It is such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for your time. I know I've actually I've seen you on two of the courses that I did lastly, and I've taken your class basically, not directly, but through those courses. One was with Sister Noor, and one was with the Panda people.
Yeah, Homeschool Panda with Saida.
Yes, Homeschool Panda. So I took both of your courses, mashallah, tabarakallah, and they were absolutely fantastic. So good to learn from you, alhamdulillah. And I know you are busy, so we will not waste any much more time. And I would love to start with you introducing about the work that you've done, the work that you've displayed so far, and how far you've come, and what are your thoughts about the recent influx of homeschoolers and the questions and the DMs that you're getting, because I've seen that, mashallah, you're very busy with actually helping out in different programs, different kinds of homeschoolers. So
yeah, alhamdulillah. Well, I'm really glad that you enjoyed both of those programs. Both women put in an extraordinary amount of time and effort and work, and so I was really pleased with being able to participate with them, because again, we talked about this just briefly about having mompreneurs and taking on projects that are going to help others and their businesses. And so those two women were fantastic. I think the content that everyone brought to the table for both of those, which by the way, both those courses are still available. Yes. You just missed the live. I mean, you still get to see the pre-recorded live portion, but you don't get to interact, which is too bad. But the rest of the content is so valuable. And so they put in a lot of effort. So definitely check those out. And I'm really glad that you got a lot out of it. There was a lot this summer. This was kind of unexpected for me, and I think for most of us, anticipating, for homeschoolers, going back and doing what we've been doing, but for the new to homeschool or new to distance learning, or whatever is going to be the label now, because there are so many different labels attached to home education. There's a bunch of new families who are embarking on that journey, and they'll find their place. Right now, it's kind of all one big home called homeschool, right. But I think over time, people will kind of find what works for them. Right. Because it's a bit of a misnomer to call it homeschool, since so many people are doing things outside the home when they homeschool. I happen to be one of those rarities in that I don't do a lot of outside classes. We don't do a lot of online classes. I do like to create our own units and our own lessons. And so I end up being my children's primary teacher most of the time. We do outsource. I'm sorry?
Up to what grade though? Do you go up to college?
Yeah, I will go through about mid-high school before I would say, yeah, mid-high school before we're outsourcing seriously. Before that, we'll outsource for Quran. Okay. Or Arabic, depending on which lessons we're doing. And then if we're outsourcing anything else, which honestly lately we haven't done much of, but in the past, now and then we would outsource, an a la carte class, and it would be not really so much in the core subject areas. In fact, I don't think it really ever was. It was more like in the extracurricular areas is where we would outsource a class. My kids did a stilt walking class one year, which was a lot of fun with a Waldorf teacher, or rather at the Waldorf school with one of the teachers there. And then we did some various sports as extracurricular classes, but for the most part, and then of course Kung Fu and martial arts, Jiu-Jitsu and whatnot. Things that I definitely couldn't learn fast enough to teach them. But for the most part, most of our lessons are taught by me, and I have such a fun time putting these units together, which are Waldorf inspired, and I'll touch on that as well. And it's okay that I don't know everything. I'm learning alongside my children. I feel like we're all on this homeschool boat together, and I should be the captain, which I am, but a lot of the times we're working together. And that's one of my greatest joys in our homeschooling journey, is that I'm being present with my children and we're learning together, and it brings me a lot of joy, and I hope that it brings them a lot of benefit as well throughout this journey.
Mashallah, you've been doing this for quite a lot of time, 2 decades?
So we started in 2003 when my oldest son was 5.
Yeah, mashallah.
And so that's, we're on our 18th year, I think. And
Tabrakallah.
yeah, so that's a long time. And a lot has changed in that time. When we first started homeschooling, there were no social media platforms. The only way you could connect online were through chat forums, which I was not interested in doing. And really, I didn't get a lot of information online. Usually I liked to get my information from people in person, and I really enjoyed attending the homeschool conferences, which have dwindled a little bit, and they've kind of made a resurgence, and now they're all online. But
Yeah.
that's where I really loved learning about homeschooling and learning about the different educational philosophies, and really just keeping myself informed along this journey. But more importantly, and this is why I think the conferences are so valuable, even if you've been homeschooling for many years, but it helped keep me motivated and inspired and just revved up for the following year. So usually the homeschool conferences were in the summer sometime, after you had time to decompress from your previous school year and just enough time for you to start thinking about your new school year. And you go to these conferences and you hear people speak passionately about homeschooling or just education in general, and it fuels you, and you're with like-minded people and you're with other homeschoolers, and all that's really, really important, because you need a lot of support on this journey, and being able to connect with others who are doing this is going to help you stay in it for the long run, rather than feeling that burnout that you might feel within a couple of years or sooner.
So why Waldorf? I mean, you could have gone with easier methodologies. I feel Waldorf is a bit overwhelming for somebody new who's learning, because the methodology is so different from anything else. Yeah. I mean, there are similarities, but still, I think it's a very unique program.
Right. So yeah, there are similarities with other educational philosophies, like you mentioned, but yeah, it does seem a lot more intensive. And that's because a teacher is teaching every single lesson. There is certainly work that a student has to do independently. Once you've delivered that lesson, students literally have to write and draw in their main lesson books. But for the most part, you're not going to find the idea of, well, here's the textbook, you read this section and you answer these questions at the end of the chapter. You're not going to find that, and therefore it is going to be more labor intensive on the teacher level, and hopefully more enjoyable on the student level. So the thing that really distinguishes the Waldorf education, or really at the heart of Waldorf education, is that it is a methodology or a curriculum that supports the child's development. And that's going to stand apart from the traditional model of education that we find in most countries, where you're not really paying attention to the actual development of a child. You're wanting to get to the end goal of a certain amount of education. And in my opinion, you're just kind of going backwards and making it age appropriate, but not necessarily developmentally appropriate. And so what you're going to find with educational philosophies like Waldorf or Charlotte Mason, Thomas Jefferson education, and even the classical approach, is that there's this recognition that children go through different developmental stages that are around every 7 years, and that there's something specific that's just right for that developing child in those different years. And because these philosophies recognize that, they then create a curriculum or create a recommendation for the types of lessons that can be done in each of those stages. What's really beautiful about this is that you'll have all of these different educational philosophies that are based on like child psychology and observation of, child development. You'll have all of them recognize that there are different stages, and yet each one will have their own uniqueness about what they think you should be teaching or how you should be teaching in each of those different stages, which is so beautiful, because you can take the same observation and yet arrive at a different conclusion about what you should be teaching in those different stages.
Absolutely. So my question to you would be then, mashallah, you have different age groups of children. You've taught it from the very beginning. Have you seen that there's always a, because every child is different and their learning pattern is different and their interest is different. So does the Waldorf philosophy help cater to that child's needs, or um, how
Yeah.
am I making sense with that question?
So there are the things that you want. I want a chocolate bar, and the
Okay.
things that you need. I
Yeah.
need my greens and my protein, right?
Right.
And then we need to find a happy medium so that we're still getting our needs fulfilled and our wants fulfilled. And so a curriculum like the Waldorf approach, or philosophy like the Waldorf approach, is looking primarily at what a developing human being needs.
Okay.
Okay, and that's really beautiful and profound in of itself. You
Right.
as a parent now, you can say, well, this is this ideal of an approach, and really I want to be doing these lessons or this approach, but also I don't have the time, or I'm not quite capable, or my child doesn't want to do these kinds of lessons. Well, that's where the joys of homeschooling come in, where you have that control. You can make those changes. You can make it a little bit more uh, you, I guess, tailored to your child's
Taylor, yes.
interests in a way.
Yeah.
But overall, what we want to avoid doing is having us do something for our children that is not developmentally appropriate. So we
Yeah.
want to avoid doing that. But after that, there's quite a lot of flexibility. So for instance, this would look like this. When your child is really young, you might recognize that handwriting is quite laborious for them because their fine motor skills haven't been developed yet. And this is really more about the physical development versus the mind development, but their fine motor skills haven't been developed yet. And so when you insist on having them do something that they're not quite, and this is an easy example to understand because it has to do with physical versus the mental development and the emotional and the spiritual development, that's different and sometimes a little bit harder to characterize.
Right.
But physical development, we recognize that a child who is maybe 5 hasn't developed those fine motor skills as well as a child who's 7 or 8 or 9. And so
Definitely.
when we're giving them small pencils and we're insisting on handwriting, while you could really insist that your child does that. And because children are capable of adaptation, they probably could achieve that. But the problem is that through that trial, you might be damaging that child's capability to really be able to do it later on, because that wasn't their mode in that moment. Their fine motor skills weren't developed. You were asking them to do something that was beyond their developmental capabilities. And so if we focus on, well, what would be developmentally appropriate for a child that age? Oh, they're still doing their gross motor skills. So let's give them a really large piece of paper, and let's give them a really large or thick paintbrush, and let's give them maybe a large crayon, and let's do large circles and big drawings, and let's not do the fine motor skills. What are we missing if we are focused on something that they're not ready for? What we're missing is being able to support the development of that child in a way that's going to allow them to flourish later on, rather than stunt their capabilities. And don't worry if you've already done this. Don't worry if you're like, oh, I'm just learning this now and I didn't do it at the right time. That's okay. Wherever you're at, start there. And you can do a lot of retroactive healing in a way, if you want to call it that, or educational healing. You can do that later on. And if you, for instance, you might find that if you're like, oh, I'm just discovering this now, I have a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, and an 11-year-old, and my 11-year-old just wants to play with Play-Doh and watercolor and do all these things that he didn't do when he was 5. That's okay. Let him do that. That's his own form of filling in those gaps in an experiential way. That's not the filling in the gaps of an academic way.
That's wonderful, mashallah. Only if we would have that much patience. The pressure of expectation and the wrong kind of expectation. I think homeschooling is where we women, mothers, especially because we are the primary teachers usually,
Right.
we
But it's
learn that
interesting that
balance.
you mentioned patience though, because you have to, I feel like you have to have even more patience trying to get your child to do something that they're not ready
Yeah.
for when you're right there next to them and pressuring them and insisting on something
Mhm.
versus saying, hey, you're not ready for this. Let's wait till next week, next month, next year, 2 years. And then they just get it without much effort. That takes, less patience in a way. It takes the patience that it does require is one of self-confidence. Like, am I confident that my child is going to get it if I wait long enough? And
Mhm.
really, that's something that you as a parent need to go through and not burden your child with.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's one of that's a homeschooling lesson 101. Don't burden your child with your wrong
Yes, yeah,
expectations.
that's a great way to say
Alhamdulillah.
it.
So, Sister Hannah, now I would like to talk about your YouTube channel, your website, where you have put, mashallah, fabulous resources. So, let's say I have done this. I have sent people on through to your YouTube channel onto your website and said, okay, go learn from her. So what are the things that you would direct the new people towards? Anybody who has always been curious about Waldorf methodology, or anybody who wants to try something new and see maybe that's going to work for me.
Yeah, actually, that's a really great question, because on my website and on my YouTube channel, I do have quite a variety of resources, and they're not all exactly Waldorf, or at least Waldorf inspired. I do have quite a few things. I wouldn't go so far as say that I've got an eclectic assortment of videos or from different philosophies. I think they all sort of circle around the Waldorf philosophy in one way or another. But if you're thinking like everything I'm doing is Waldorf, it really isn't. And that could be of confusion if someone, landed at my site and they're like, oh, wait a minute, you're using the Ordinary Parent's Guide to Reading. That's definitely not Waldorf. And so, yes, I do bring in some of the other resources that I've really enjoyed over the years. And so on my website and on my YouTube channel, I do have a couple of videos that just sort of introduce Waldorf education and why we chose it, but nothing that's too in depth. And so I can understand that it could be a little bit confusing. What you will find is me actually practicing
Yeah.
my approach to a Waldorf inspired
Yep.
homeschool. And
Yep.
so you're going to see main lessons. You're going to see a rotation of subjects called main lesson blocks. I tend to use unit studies as a way just to communicate what we're doing, but it's not really a unit study, but I feel like that's a little bit more understandable versus a main lesson block. You're going to see particular lessons taught in certain years based on the child's development. All those things are going to be very Waldorf. Another thing that you're going to see is pretty much no screen time for educational purposes and extremely limited screen time or media for everything else. We do love our movie nights, and my kids have played computer games. In fact, my oldest actually works for a gaming company, and so it's not like we don't have those, but I try to push them as far aside as possible, but they're definitely not part of our education in any way. We will use them for entertainment. The only exception is audiobooks. And so my kids frequently will have headphones on listening to audiobooks as they're doing other things. And they used to not have headphones. We used to just play it like on a CD player, but technology and all.
Yeah.
And so that is the one exception to the media rule that I have, but that's definitely going to be something that's very Waldorf inspired, and also just inspired by just the research I've done about what screen time does to a child's brain. So that's something that you're definitely going to see, limited or no screen time. And then the other thing is also having a lot of open-ended toys, and also making play a priority, and making time with friends and socialization a priority over academics, because that has a very limited window of opportunity, especially for pretend play and imagination. And of course, because we're taking our children out of a social setting, which is a public school or private school, I definitely make it a priority to include any kind of friends, play dates, any of those things. I definitely will put them above our academics, especially in the younger ages. Obviously, it starts to taper off as the children get older, of course, but when they're younger, I definitely put that as a priority. So those are things that you're really going to see that I feel are very Waldorf inspired.
Okay. So now I think of this question, that your setup is very different, right? And you have certain rules about screen time and everything. So when you're socializing, then how do you choose the kind of people your children are socializing with? Because majority of them.
Mhm. That is such a good question. Here's what it required me to do. It required me to do, 90% of the work when it came to any of the things that I wanted my way. So for instance, suppose you're getting together with friends and your friend is okay with screen time. And so if you go visit her at her house, the kids are all going to have their iPads and screen time. And then I'm like, I went through the effort to drive here and be here and spend 2 hours of my life. I could have easily had my kids on the screen at home and I could have taken a break. I mean, obviously socializing with friends for adults can be a break too. But the point is that I didn't go through all this effort just for them to be in front of a screen. So if that's the case, then it's like, well, then I need you on my territory, because if you're at my house, we're not going to have screen times, or we're going to meet at a park and then we're not going to have screen times. And so that's just one thing, is like, you're going to have to do more of the work. So what does that mean?
Hardly maneuver around that topic. And
You have to take the lead on this, but it means that, maybe it means that you have to clean your house and prepare food and be the hostess, and that can be super draining if the priority is that you don't want the screen times. If you don't mind, and you're like, well, when we're with friends, I'm going to make the exception, that's totally up to you. But it required me to open my home often, so that I could be in control of how we were going to socialize, how the kids were going to socialize. And that just was a lot more work on me. And I was willing to do it because it was a priority for me.
So what I keep hearing is you did a lot of work when it came to the methodologies that you chose. Teacher-led majority, teacher-led in a way that you are the primary teacher. You are the textbook. And when it came to playtime, then again, you took on the major burden. You were like, okay, fine. You know what? If I want something for my children and for myself as well, and I need it to be it my way, because that's the philosophy I want to be instilled with my family values, I'm not going to, tamper around that too much so that my children might become confused. So you took that also upon yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, parenting is going to be time consuming. It's going to be exhausting. It's going to be fulfilling. And we all are given the same amount of time, and maybe not the same bandwidth, but we're given the same amount of time. And you definitely can decide like what your priorities are and then work with them. But whatever you choose, it's not going to be, less time. It may be less effort in some ways, but we're all putting in the same amount of time. And so if you're worried like, oh, I can't do that. Well, maybe you can't do it because it's just not your priority. But once it becomes your priority, you make room for it in your life, and it starts to flourish. And it's not quite as overwhelming as you maybe thought it was once you get into the habit of it. But at first you can think like, oh my gosh, my kids were in school and now they're home and now they're not going to have any screen time and now I got to do everything. Well, over time, they learn how to do things for themselves because you're not there to entertain them. You're there to facilitate for them a healthy educational environment. And when children are engaged in independent and pretend play, you don't have to do anything.
that's
They
true.
are
That's
really
absolutely true.
engaged. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
Mashallah.
so eventually I feel like it takes less time. It's kind of like bottle feeding and breastfeeding. At first, breastfeeding is really laborious. It's a steep learning curve for some women. It can be really challenging, but then after you get over that, you're like, wow, this was a breeze. I can, feed my child anywhere. I don't need any special equipment. And I feel like that's the same way with some of these different methodologies. It might take a little bit of work up front, but then later on, you're just like, wow, this is really beneficial.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. So are you offering any courses? And also another question, do you do any coaching or do you just offer curriculums and unit studies?
Yeah, I'm embarking on some new things as of the last few months. It's been very exciting. I am doing some consulting, coaching. I do prefer the word coaching over consulting because I feel like that's a little bit more representative of what I can do for families, for women, for teachers who are embarking on whatever educational journey they are embarking on. And so I do offer that. It's very limited. I only have a few spots open every month just because that's a very time consuming endeavor. As rewarding as it is, it's very time consuming. And then I don't have any specific courses right now that are in like where I'm involved in it in the capacity that you saw in the summer. My courses are basically I've got one on geometry and I've got one on the watercoloring.
Those are good ones, actually. The women who are new, who just want to get some printouts or ideas. I mean, that would be awesome. So geometry, you said,
and watercolor, like, for watercoloring. And basically these are just lessons where you can follow along as a parent, or your student can follow along and do these lessons alongside with me and my children as we do these lessons. And then of course I do have the curriculum, a small selection now, but hopefully it'll continue to grow. And those are new offerings that I've got, but they're based on what we do in our homeschool. And some things are just not available, or I haven't found them, and so I've just created them and now have made them available for everyone else.
Mashallah, tabrakallah. So we can find you on pepperandpine.com.
Yep, right. Pepperandpine.com, and I'm pretty active on Instagram and on, and on YouTube, and a little bit on Facebook, and Twitter not so much.
Alhamdulillah, you have your hands full. Mashallah, tabarakallah. Jazakallahu khair for your time, Sister Hana. This was a wonderful conversation. I love the part where you said you're not an entertainer, you're a facilitator, and if you do it right, then alhamdulillah, you will see the fruits of your labor.
I believe so. Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome. And I would love to, inshallah, be in more conversations with you. Today, you were the 10th episode, actually. And I'm so humbled and grateful for your time. Thank you so much. What is your daughter doing, actually? She was picking out something and she's drawing or coloring or painting.
She has been working with a lot of paper dolls lately. So she's been coloring profusely for the last several hours. So she's got like 50 of them, and she keeps coloring them in. She's got stencils, and then she'll cut them out, and then she'll play with them and make up stories with them. And so I'm not quite sure and she loves to hear what I'm talking about. So she was with me for a few minutes, and then I'm not sure what she got behind me, but maybe it was a game of some sort. I did rearrange my schoolroom a little bit, so there are some board games right behind me. Yeah.
Mashallah, mashallah. Wonderful. Inshallah. We'll stay in touch. Thank you once again. And take care. Assalamu alaikum.
All right. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.